Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Welcome to the Imaginaries, a podcast where we discuss imaginary things of all shapes and sizes, or none of those things, because never mind. Moving on, we are going to talk about something that we are very excited about here on the Imaginaries, which is a series of books that has been adapted for television, and y'all might have heard of it. It's called The Expanse. At least that is what the television series is called. The book series itself goes by various other names. The first being Leviathan Wakes, and the second being Caliban's War, I believe. So, we are going to talk a little bit about this series, about hard science fiction, and about how this intersects with where we're at today in terms of what we get out of science fiction, what we want out of science fiction, and so on and so forth. So, my name is Kendra, and I am here with my co-host, Tony. Say hi.
Hello.
And we are just going to dive straight in. So, Tony, how long has it been since you read the books? And did you read more than one book, or did you just read the first book?
I read the first book, and it has been more than 1 year, but no more than 3.
Okay. So, you've slept since then, is what you're saying.
Once or twice.
Just once or twice.
Yeah.
God, I wish I had your stamina. So, do you remember much about it?
I remembered when I watched the first season of The Expanse last summer, different plot details, different characters. I had thought that I had forgotten most of the book, but it came back to me as I saw it again, and I was reviewing it in my head. I would say at this point, because it's been passed through the filter of me watching the first season of The Expanse, I don't remember the book super well, but I remember it enough to compare and contrast in the way we're going to do for this podcast.
Which honestly might be the perfect place to be going into season 2, because there is enough of an alteration between the plot of the first and second books and what they do with the beginning of season 2. Those of y'all who are listening to us who have yet to watch the first season or the second season, don't worry. We're not going to give away huge plot spoilers apart from, well, there are certain details which probably are on the back jacket of the book, which I do not have with me and can't verify. But there are certain details that are kind of general knowledge about the series, which we'll discuss. But generally speaking, the books are adapted fairly well and straightforwardly into the television series, but the time progression is altered, and when characters spin off on their various arcs is altered, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, it's kind of nice to have forgotten some of what happens in the books, because then you can relax into the television series a little bit better. And the television series, in my personal opinion, is well worth relaxing into. Mm-hmm. How did you receive the television series? And like maybe unravel that a little bit for us too, in terms of like, how did you hear about this series? Was it from me? I don't remember whether I recommended it to you or not. And what was your general experience with watching season 1?
To your question, this was last summer, like I said, so summer of 2016. And Andrew and I were watching through the pilots or first episodes, just the first episodes of a number of TV shows. Killjoys was one of them. What's one of the other contemporary sci-fi shows?
Like on Syfy channel?
Yeah.
It's Killjoys and the Dark Matter series.
Yeah, Dark Matter, I think, was another one of them.
Helix. Yeah, probably those would be the 3 that I remember really well.
Anyway, so we watched at least a couple of those, and I was just not impressed at all. And that I think I talked about some of those way back in one of our earliest episodes when we talked about shows we didn't want to watch based on watching the pilot.
the shows that we dropped. Yeah.
Right. The Expanse, on the other hand, it hooked me in a couple of ways. It hooked me not only because the first episode was interesting and I connected with the characters and there was a lot going on, and it ended in such a way that I wanted to keep watching. Mm-hmm. And I think we should definitely dig into more of what was working not only in the first episode but in the first season. But I also had that connection to the book, and so it was exciting to be like, or to remind myself that I hadn't forgotten this entirely, that I actually did remember these characters and sort of what happened, but not where it went, and not when it happened, and things like that. So, but, I don't want to peg my personal positive reception on those two things. I think a lot was working for this show, and it was enjoyable. Like, the cast was stellar. The pacing as I watched more episodes was really well done. The writing was really strong. The casting was... That show has one of the best ensembles I've seen in years, not just for a science fiction show, but for a television show generally.
Agreed.
So there were a lot of good things going on that invited me to watch past the first episode, which I did, and then I think we watched the entire show over the course of a week, which, it's like 10 episodes, and I know for some people who might have watched it all in one day, that doesn't sound like a lot, but for my television watching habits, watching even like a 10 episode season in a week is a lot. So
yeah, and I mean, in a 10 episode season of a show where a lot of shit happens, it's not quite the same as, say, marathoning Stranger Things, another wonderful science fiction show that's on the air. Stranger Things, generally speaking, has fewer characters. They're not going off in separate plot arcs. They are a pretty tight-knit group. And in The Expanse, even from the first episode of the first season, you have three major locations.
yes.
And at each location, you have an ensemble cast.
Yes.
In the second season of this show, you expand that by several locations. And it's super interesting how they do this. So, yeah, it's a massive show. I remember the first episode feeling really noisy to me, and not necessarily in a problematic way, but in a way where you're getting a lot thrown at you and you're expected to keep up. And honestly, that was really pleasurable because a lot of science fiction shows kind of baby you along, especially as concerns the science. And we'll talk about the science of The Expanse quite a bit over the course of this episode.
You mentioned when we talked about N.K. Jemisin and her book, The Fifth Season, that one of the reasons you liked it is she doesn't fuck around. Her first line starts with the end of the world, gets it out of the way, and you said, like, goddamn, like, we cut through all the bullshit, like, we didn't have to wade through anything. She starts where it should start, and that's how The Expanse felt to me.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of scaffolding. There wasn't a lot of having to establish people's backstories. There was a little bit of scene setting, which was good scene setting and necessary to establish what's really important and foundational about the show's architecture, which is the relationship between Mars as a cultural and social and political construct, and Earth as the same thing, and the belt, which is the outer planets and solar system. Yeah, so that kind of background was necessary because a lot of people coming into the show didn't even know how the world worked. So you got a little bit of that, and I don't think it was handled perfectly. There's nothing that's perfect about any show, but I think, generally speaking, with so many balls in the air, that first episode did a lot of hard work, and generally speaking did it very well. So my exposure to the show, was inspired by, I think it was probably mentioned on IO9, and we've talked about IO9 in the past several times. It's a great place to discover new things to nerd out over. And I remember seeing that there was a show that was going to be adapted and was in production, and that's what prompted me to pick up the first book in the series. And I have since learned that that's probably not something I should do with adaptations that I know are coming in general. Now I prefer to wait until after the adaptation is out. So I have yet to finish the book series that inspired and will continue to inspire The Expanse, God willing, and funding permitting, and all of those wonderful things, because I want to experience the show first and then go back and fill in all of the gaps and the details and round out the world and the characters. I understand people who do it the opposite way, but for me, I can enjoy both if I start with the adaptation, but I can't always enjoy both if I start with the book that it's adapted from.
Well, let's go ahead and capture that particular feeling and expand upon it. So, The Expanse, The Expanse is an adaptation, obviously, of a novel, a series of novels, as it goes through its seasons. Generally, I fall in the camp of saying when you adapt a TV show or a movie, even a radio show or like a play or something from source material that is a book or a series of books, generally the books are better. And I say that in a way that is totally snobbish on the one hand, but also in the way that books can do a lot more. They can expand in ways that TV shows can't. You can really get in a character's head, and whether or not you can do that on screen really depends upon the strength of the actor and the way they're deciding to play the character, and a lot of different variables that go into that. All of which is to say, The Expanse is one of those rare pieces of media where I thought the adaptation on screen was much stronger than the source material.
I think that's a fair assessment. I don't know if I could say much because I don't remember the book as clearly. I do remember, several podcasts ago we talked about the cinematic and how it plays out in science fiction. I do remember as I was reading the first book in the Expanse series, Leviathan Wakes, that this was an extraordinarily cinematic novel. And I wondered how it would adapt, knowing at the time that it was being adapted. And I looked forward to it because it seemed, even in its book form, to be rich in visuals and in the kind of scientific details which translate well to screen. And I was hoping, against hope, that they would get a cast that would live up to what was on the page. And I think that's part of where the show has leapt past the books. I think the show has collected a cast, and possibly a crew too. I don't know as much about them, but a cast that is really, for lack of a better term, stellar. And especially, I have to say, Shorey Agdashlu, I believe is how you pronounce her name. She, as Christian Avasarala, is perhaps one of my favorite women in science fiction. Character and actress combined make for one of my favorite characters in science fiction. She delivers the lines from James S.A. Corey with such precision and passion and color. And her Earth is actually interesting to me in a way that the Earth sort of culture and political scene in the books were not. So I think the characters really are helping the actors are helping to pull those characters beyond where they might have lived in the books.
Yes.
And it's worth noting here too, I think as we talk about the general world of The Expanse, that James S.A. Corey, the author of The Expanse, it's two men writing together, Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank, and they are on the writing staff. They're in the writing room of the television series. So if you're talking about adaptation that honors the material, you can't ask for a better setup. And apparently they really work well with the rest of the direction team and production team. And so it's one of those happy instances where authors are getting involved in the adaptation and not in a way that stifles the alterations that need to be made in order to make it translate well. Yeah. So, kudos to you, James S.A. Corey, both people that you are.
Well, I find it interesting, and I forget, I don't think we talked about this in the cinematic podcast, but it seems to me that one of the things that could make a work of written fiction particularly cinematic is the fact that it's not a very good piece of written work. Because, and I'm thinking here not only of the books that are informing The Expanse, but also Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire. I have the same problem with both of those book series, in that you can tell that a lot of work has gone into plotting things out and figuring out how things unfold and how all these people are related to each other. But to me, it's like reading a really dry Wikipedia article or something instead of reading a novel. Like, the prose is not really interesting, the character work is not really interesting, the dialogue is not particularly interesting, and yet it serves as this really awesome scaffolding for both for The Expanse and Game of Thrones TV genre dramas that really, really work, that are really strong. So I find that really interesting. And on the one hand, I hope that it's not a trend, because I would rather have a really strong novel or series of novels that works on multiple levels as novels, rather than a novel that is sort of, a washed out version of a good TV show that it may become. And I think that we've already seen some skewing towards that. And I do actually remember that we talked about this a little bit in the cinematic podcast as I'm talking. But focusing specifically on The Expanse, I will not be reading any more books in that series, but I will be watching The Expanse.
Yeah, I might read the books years in the future once the series has terminated, in part because I don't feel fully convinced that Syfy will be able to sustain the television series for as long as it will take to cover all the material in the novels and the novellas. Because one of the things that's happening by having two pretty prolific authors paired together on this is that the books, there's 9 slated for publication right now, and it could expand to include more. So that's a lot. That's a lot of written material to pack into a TV show, and I don't think Syfy can commit to being around in 9 years, much less being able to commit to one show for that long. Sci-fi shows in general are tenuously funded, and I'm talking about science fiction shows are tenuously funded. Fox is infamous for running a bunch of sci-fi shows for half a season or a full season. Cough, cough, Firefly. But they're not alone, and Sci-Fi Channel has been experimenting around a lot lately to see if they can hit on something that works. And in returning to the spaceship drama, like they did in Killjoys and Dark Matter and The Expanse, all very different shows, but they've found that those shows are attracting audiences in a way that other shows they've experimented with haven't. And so right now it seems like we'll get another season of The Expanse, but we're coming up to the time during the airing of the season when executives start questioning that and start proposing and pushing and trying to get that funding. So if you are a fan of The Expanse, the television series, I can't possibly encourage you more or hope to encourage you more. I really, really hope to encourage you to reach out on Twitter or email whoever needs to be emailed to voice your support for the series. And more importantly than that is to tune in the night that the show airs.
Aside, I think we should totally talk about that in another podcast, how flawed that system is, because I don't know, I couldn't honestly tell you, like, the last time I watched a show actually on television. Like, it's been literally years. Like, I contribute to ratings in no way. And it's kind of fucked up as, like, that decides things. And since we've moved way past, like, the cable model, like, it was funny because I'm thinking of the Olympics here, because I really wanted to watch the Olympics over the summer. I could literally not find a friend who had cable TV. Like, it was that bad. So,
yeah,
anyway.
Most people who I know who watch the Olympics, they did it through the website.
Yeah, right.
the NBC website, I believe it was.
Yeah.
And some different channels, broadcast or cable, will allow the web streaming to count towards the total, but generally speaking, they also require a subscriber's fee for that.
You were talking about The Expanse as hard science fiction, and what I don't really know how I want to phrase this question, but talk about hard science fiction in The Expanse. Go!
Okay, so hard science fiction, if you haven't heard this term before, we've lobbed it around a bunch, but if you haven't heard it before, it essentially refers to science fiction that could feasibly be real or operates on real scientific precepts or in some way, shape, or form is reaching for believability on a scientific level. And so hard science fiction has been around probably from the beginning of science fiction as a written form, but it hasn't been the distilled down art form that it has become in the last couple of decades. So we've talked in various podcasts, and we'll get back to talking about in future podcasts, Kim Stanley Robinson and his various books. And he came of age, would you say 80s or 90s?
I would say 80s, but I also, I'm going to maybe ask you to qualify what you mean as hard science fiction coming into its own as an art form, because I would argue that, especially Golden Age and even earlier, science fiction was pretty much only hard science fiction. So tell me a little bit more about what you mean.
Well, there I might be running into a little bit of a roadblock, and I've admitted to you in the past I haven't read widely among the Golden Age science fiction authors. So I might have just painted with a really broad stroke a bunch of authors that I haven't read. So apologies, Golden Age sci-fi authors. I honestly don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about you. However, when I go back to the very beginning of science fiction, I don't see a lot of hard science fiction according to today's standards is what I would qualify, in that our understanding of science has progressed so massively since, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Frankenstein were coming into their own. The understanding of science, you might have had authors taking big stabs at being realistic and believable in their uses and touches of science, but we don't look at Frankenstein and say that's a believable way to create a reanimated corpse. We tend to think of it as more science fantasy now.
That's true.
So
that's actually, if I can deviate for just a moment, that's actually a really interesting thought, and I wonder if we can talk more about that in the future. But I think that context plays a huge role here, and I want to take the example of Frankenstein, even though I don't want to argue that Frankenstein, when Mary Shelley wrote it, was meant to be in any way hard science fiction. Like, I think it was meant to be very allegorical, very much, of the time in which she was writing. But when I think of who wrote Starship Troopers? Heinlein. If I think of
Heinlein,
Robert Heinlein, that is, even though a novel like Farmer in the Sky by him may not have aged well, as far as Farmer in the Sky is about terraforming one of Jupiter's moons, and we didn't know a lot about Jupiter's moons when Heinlein was writing. Or we knew a bit, but obviously not as much as we know today, especially
we hadn't had like Voyager's pictures or Cassini
exactly
any of these outer solar system robotics.
Yes. So I think that when we apply the label of hard science fiction, and of course I'm keeping in mind, as you said, that you're not super familiar with the golden age of science fiction, and I'm not really, really super familiar with it either, but it seems like context is an important thing to keep in mind, that even though if I read that book now, I'm like, yeah, right, like, that could never happen. Like, when he was writing it, it was hard science fiction, not because necessarily of the feasibility, but because of the current state of science and the place from which he was writing about it.
So, I think you just changed my mind on a bunch of things. So, I think, apologies, dear listeners, but I definitely misstepped in a lot of ways by drawing some sort of comparison between modern authors and past authors. It might be a matter of degree to inspiration. I think of the books that were coming out in the 70s, and can you imagine for the first time seeing pictures from another world outside of our planetary Earth and the Moon system? Can you imagine when those first pixels started downloading, as we saw pictures of Ganymede and all these beautiful outer solar system moons that we had no notion of what they looked like, and suddenly there they are, and they're new and they're bright worlds that we can be inspired by. I think of the wonder and the awe of science fiction from the time period where we were starting to see these moons, and I compare them, for better or worse, to today's books, where we have maps of the surface of Mars down to like half a kilometer or something ridiculous, thanks to Mars HiRISE and various other orbital objects around Mars. And we have detailed maps of Ganymede and pretty much every planet now. We have them of Pluto, which is magnificent. You can get globes of Pluto with actual recognizable features. And So we live in a time when we've mapped our planets down to the kilometer, and where we can use detailed detailed geographic information to write our books. And so you can have books like Kim Stanley Robinson's, which draw upon like accurate mapping, or at least at the time semi-accurate mapping in his Mars trilogy of the planet. And we've learned a lot since the Mars trilogy came out.
Yeah, we have.
Like
and
there's a lot less water than he thought.
Right. And it's interesting actually to use that example of something that, of a series of novels that was and is hard science fiction. Like he did a lot of work, and I mean a lot of work, to get the Mars science correct. And yet science has marched on. Like there are things that we've discovered in the past few decades which have invalidated some of the things that were in that book. And that doesn't mean it's no longer a work of hard science fiction.
And I think we've even invalidated some of the science in the last year or two
totally.
Since The Martian.
Yeah.
And that's even more mind-blowing. Like now we know you don't get a sandstorm on Mars that can knock out communications, or in the way that it does. It won't impale someone with a communications antenna.
Right.
And we won't actually be able to take our Mars suits into our HABs because the fines will get into everything and kill you. And there isn't enough water, and the soil is perchlorates and super toxic. Like that's all from the last decade, and some of it from the last 5 years that we've realized that. So when you're talking about writing hard science fiction, and this takes us back to The Expanse, you're always aiming for a moving target. And one of the things that's brilliant about The Expanse is it takes such a leap into the future that even though it tries valiantly to present us with believable science and believable socio-political and economic structures, it has some leeway there, and it'll age better than a text that's set, say, 50 years in the future or 100 years in the future. By setting it hundreds of years in the future, it takes it beyond what could possibly be known, what could possibly be aged out of relevance in the next decade, even 20 years. So I think this show does what Battlestar Galactica did, which is to move us so far into the future, or in Battlestar Galactica, it's kind of the future past, right? It removes us enough from the current day that you have more freedom to build your story around plot and character. You don't feel as constrained by, say, having to lock your helmet and your suit on the outside of your Mars habitat and like go over all of those details. So I think The Expanse, even though it might not be as much of a favorite for me right now as The Martian, I think it'll age better. And I don't know how you feel about that, but I think it's kind of cool that we're given this.
I think it strikes an important balance in the same way that Kim Stanley Robinson does with the Mars trilogy and 2312 and other books that are set in, I know there's I had a term for this, I think there is a term for this, but the kind of science fiction that isn't looking necessarily at the next 50 or even 100 years, and also isn't looking to the far future. And by far future, I mean that could be temporally or it could be technologically, like with something like Star Trek, but it's somewhere in the middle, where it's relatively realistic in that we don't have faster than light travel, we're colonizing the solar system, but is also, definitely the realm of the fantastical in that we're colonizing the solar system and terraforming planets and living in the asteroid belt and things like that. So, I appreciate that the Expanse is doing that. And I get what you're saying, or I understand why we think of it, or why we can think of it as hard science fiction, but I guess I wouldn't group it in with The Martian, exactly, or even with, say, something like Arrival, or Contact, even. I would say
Well, those are all set, present day or just like a couple years in the future.
Right. Which seems important, and I think obviously all of those works are different just based on when they're set. I guess there aren't a lot of good examples of like near future hard science fiction that seem
near distant future, because we have like the Culture series, which is way future,
right? And I guess I would have to go, beyond Kim Stanley Robinson or something like Pamela Sargent's Venus books. Like I'd have to go back pretty far. Like I think that this particular time period, this particular way of doing science fiction is not all that popular. And so I was actually, again, for our listeners, Kendra and I exchange notes and talk about some things before we record, and I was a little surprised that you had listed a number of properties, including Gravity, The Martian, Interstellar, Arrival, The Westworld, Black Mirror, as shows that are really hitting this hard science fiction edge, because I think that even though The Expanse maybe shares some characteristics with those, it is doing things that are different. It's doing things that are different from other properties that have been on screen in the past 5, 10, even 20 years. And I think it's pleasurable for those reasons. And we can...
I think...
Yes.
It's... In those terms, it might be a closer cousin of something that we're not used to associating with it at all, which is Firefly, and possibly the first 20 minutes of Avatar, the James Cameron Blue Alien movie, which are the best 20 minutes of the film, honestly, where you're seeing, I guess it's New York in the future, and then you're seeing his journey out to the planet Pandora. Don't hate me for referencing this movie. The cinematic elements to those first 20 minutes are sublime. It's just when you start getting into the colonial plotline and the hero savior white man thing, and the fetishizing of native cultures, that I really get my hackles up about Avatar. By the way, the new Disney park that's based on it sounds super creepy. Oh my god. Never mind. So I think Firefly makes for a good parallel to The Expanse. Not in tone at all, but in the futureness of it. You have a similar setup, actually. You have core worlds that were colonized first and are richer, and so on and so forth. It's a new solar system that they've colonized, but you have a similar setup where you have the core worlds at the center that are rich in resources and wealthy, and everyone who lives there has access to medical care and so on and so forth. And then you have the outer worlds in this solar system with lots of worlds like Trappist, Trappist worlds. I'm seeing that as the Firefly solar system right now.
Yeah, cool.
And so you do have this tension between inner and outer, which is so explicitly exploited in The Expanse and is just background noise in Firefly. But it's a similar setup, right? It's just, I guess it must be set far enough in the future that we've actually reached another solar system. But in terms of how those planets and those cultures relate to each other, it's much more of a parallel than, say, The Martian or Interstellar or Gravity or Ex Machina or Her or any of these quote-unquote hard science fiction films and movies and television shows that are trying to do the science, but trying to do them in a way that's closer to home, I think. I don't know. I might be rambling here. Shut me up, Tony. Shut me up. Move us on.
All right. Well, let's talk about diversity. Because you had noted that there's emphasis in the show on getting it there. There was emphasis in the books on getting it there. And I have to say, I don't remember that. But I will say that one of the few things that I remember liking about the books over what the TV show does is the Belters' physicality. The Belters were described, and I am doing an ass pull here because it's been a while and I didn't look this up. before we recorded, but I remember that the Belters were, there were physical differences between a person who was from the Belt, who grew up in the Belt, and from someone who didn't. They were taller and they didn't do as well in higher gravity and something like that. And I understand the limitations of a television show and what you can realistically do. Like, it would be hard to only hire actors who are taller than 7 feet, or stretch
or your
them
main
in
cast
CGI,
is super small.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Right. So I get that would be difficult. But with that said, I find it interesting and potentially, productively allegorical that the writers of the novel series chose to try and illustrate this physical difference and make it a basis for what's essentially fantastic racism.
Sure.
What I don't find so interesting is that it was a physical difference. That there is something you can look at and say, that person is different from me, whether you're a Belter or you're a person looking at a Belter. That is more ham-handed than I would have seen. Coming out on the other side, I kind of don't like that the show hasn't done a whole lot with that. There's been a little bit.
Can I put in a plug,
Please
though?
do.
Because in the first season you had hints at trying to explain the differences between Belter and Earther and Martian. There's an episode in the first season where you meet the Martians for the first time, essentially. And one of them has this nice little monologue at the end of an episode. No spoilers, but it kind of sets up some of what makes the Martian dream and vision for the future different than the others. Mm-hmm. And then you also had Thomas Jane as Miller, who's this sort of semi-corrupt cop on series. He and his relationship with his partner were used. His partner is an Earther who recently arrived on series. That is used as a way to kind of explain some of the gestural differences and the linguistic differences between Belters and the interplanetary citizens. And in season 2, that is exploded way out. You have people speaking Belter on screen for full sentences without subtitles, and it's just, you're expected to keep up. And you have a lot more Belters featuring in season 2. Again, no spoilers, but you're spending a lot more time in the outer solar system. Sorry, Christian Avasarala, I love you, but there's a lot more happening in the outer planetary areas. And it's actually fascinating to see how they're establishing the linguistic differences specifically. And that I do actually find more graceful and more interesting than a physical difference. There you're seeing the gestures that the Belters used to communicate when they were wearing spacesuits, and that they've carried over into regular conversation. You're seeing a lot more of that, and you're hearing a lot more Belter dialect. And there are spots and pieces out there for people who are super nerds about The Expanse, where you can hear from the dialect coaches and the various people on the cast and crew who are engaging with this, that specific thing that you're talking about. So I think they're doing a better job in season 2 of highlighting that and making it more interesting. And they're making it a point of division in a way that it wasn't before. Mm-hmm. So it's a way to set alliances and to demonstrate miscommunications and problems in communication between people of different cultures. Mm-hmm. Which I'm grateful for, in part because you do have several major storylines centering around otherwise fairly vanilla white males rampaging around the solar system. Mm-hmm. And if they were to be portrayed as simply straight up savior archetypes, that would be really hard for me to swallow. But seeing them struggle to communicate with Belters and to not become just the Earther stereotype, it's interesting, even if the character themselves is not as interesting to me. The framing is making it more interesting. Mm-hmm. And I've just rambled on a bunch, and I realize we're getting close to having to wrap up this conversation. So let's take it back to diversity and end there.
All right.
Because we haven't talked about why that's important in science fiction, and we haven't talked about what they are doing really well in terms of getting diversity on screen. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, let's start with why it's important. And I think that obviously that can be an entire conversation where we could talk about why diversity in science fiction is important. And here I mean diversity of all types, sexuality, gender, sex, race, ethnicity, class, pretty much anything you could think of. If there's some sort of diversity that's not illustrated in mainstream science fiction, it's worth seeing it. In part because science fiction is one of those genres that has been typically marginalized, sort of, swept to the outside, dismissed as not important, and that's both troubling, but it can be really empowering as well. If you're already on the margins, if you're already at the boundary of what's accepted and what's given, let's just say what's accepted, then it's easier to step beyond that boundary or to break that boundary. And so a lot of folks who maybe weren't able to see themselves in the standard straight white male savior of a lot of science fiction of years gone past, not that it's gone away entirely, but it's less prevalent, I would say now, or at least you see more diverse science fiction in all those important ways being published. It's important that we see that because folks who consume science fiction are often also marginalized at the edges, at the border of something, in whatever, many ways that may be. It may be just that, or I don't mean to say just, but it may be that you're kind of a nerdy white kid trying to find your way in the world. And, science fiction may help you. On the other hand, you might be really intersectional. You might be from, an economically impoverished family of color. You might be a woman, a queer woman, who finds herself in the fiction of Octavia Butler or of N.K. Jemisin or Nnedi Okorafor or someone. So it's really important, I think, that, for example, Dominique Tipper has a prominent role on The Expanse, that Shoria Agdashlu has an important role on The Expanse. You're seeing, because it allows you as a viewer to see yourself in all these diverse roles that you couldn't necessarily see yourself in before. And I'm going just for race and ethnicity here and sex and gender, but we wanted to talk a little bit about, or I know you wanted to talk about the potential, what we could potentially do with sexuality as well. And I hope that The Expanse expands into some of that in the second season and beyond. What do you think?
I think it will. I have a little bit of an advantage over you on this because I am watching The Expanse, the day after it airs as it goes on. And one of the things that I think season 2 has done to expand upon the good sort of stabs at intersectionality that the first season made is it introduces Bobby Draper at the very beginning of season 2. In fact, season 2 opens with Martian Marine Bobby Draper, who is she's portrayed in the books and cast in the television series as a woman of color and of a very specific ethnic background. And I do believe there was some discussion during the casting call for this character over really trying to get someone who matched the ethnic background mentioned in the book around which her character is designed. And they were struggling. And then the actress who ends up being Bobby in the show, she shows up and she's perfect. And she's like a wrestler or something in real life. And she has this great, phenomenal line in one of the early episodes of season 2, where her team is kind of joking around about using sex as a weapon, and she turns and looks at them and she says, "I don't use sex as a weapon. I use weapons as weapons," and then walks away. And it's this great moment because here's a character who firmly resists sexual stereotypes as well as multiple cultural stereotypes. And even though there are problematic elements to the books, especially, and how they try so hard to be diverse that in some ways they misstep and they fetishize diversity. I think the television series has done a good job steering clear of that. And again, I think a lot of that comes down to a really phenomenal cast. And Shohreh Aghdashloo is just, she's magic wherever she goes. I mean, she could toss a dozen F-bombs over her shoulder and they would sprout and turn into beautiful works of art. And, I'm a huge fan of hers, but not because she stands for a bunch of things that I think are cool. It's because she is a kick-ass actress.
Yes.
And she transforms what she's given and transmutes it into something greater. So I think that stands true for a lot of the cast. And I think Dominique Tipper is and will remain one of my favorite actresses after the show. I think that she's done something really special as well. And I can't talk up the actresses specifically in this series enough.
And I think that's important to note. And I stand by what I said before, that it is important when you are a consumer of science fiction to see characters who are like you, to see authors who are like you in that media. And yet, Shohreh Aghdashloo is not just Indian actress who is older. She, we couldn't swap in anyone else. She's important and wonderful because she's Shohreh Aghdashloo. There's no one who could, sub out. Who we don't have an understudy of Shohreh Aghdashloo in the wings. She just happens to be someone who is Indian, who is a woman, who we can describe as these things, but she as a person is awesome and unique, and we love her, and she's just fantastic in this role. So I'm happy. I'm really happy with what the show is doing. I hope that we're going to see more diversity in what it does in the future and in what other good science fiction shows on television can do and will do.
Sure. And I think that makes for a great closing point in that it ties back to what we were saying about funding. We got to put our money where our mouths are on diversity, as well as on the shows that we want to see future seasons of. Sci-Fi Channel will continue to build a diverse sort of collection and suite of shows if those shows get watched and funded. And whether or not the system that funds them is outdated, I think it's worth paying attention to in terms of books and movies and television shows. We got to put our bucks on diversity, and diversity in sex, in gender, in ethnicity, all of it. It's got to all be something that we invest in. And so, as we transition out of talking about The Expanse today, I think that would be my kind of closing takeaway. Mm-hmm. It's a very practical one. Yeah. What do you think as we close out The Expanse? Anything that we've missed?
There's so much to like here. We had notes on aesthetics, we had notes on genre, drama, and shock. We had more notes on the pacing, on the cast, on comparing them to science fantasy that's on TV. There's so much we could talk about The Expanse. We will in the future, I'm sure, as long as it remains on the air and we remain on the air. But I think this is a great place for us to end this episode talking about the first season of The Expanse and the book that it is based on, Leviathan Wakes. So, let's go ahead and tell everyone where to find us in the future. Please hop on Twitter. You can find us at imaginary_pod. Please find us on iTunes and give us a review. Even if you don't listen to us on iTunes, you can give us a review, because we would really appreciate just your feedback, positive, negative, all of it. You can also find us on SoundCloud. You can find our backlist on YouTube, and we link those off of our Twitter page. So Twitter is really the home of our backlist as well as our current shows. And you can also find our website, which hopefully we will actually make good on developing a little bit more over the future weeks. And that is at www.imaginaries.us. So thank you so much for listening to us today.
You have some homework, which is to go and watch The Expanse. Maybe don't read it. That's up to you. But definitely watch it. The production value is stellar, and there's so many other things to like about it. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, go out and expand your horizons.